Officer Taylor's pen stopped mid-stroke. Not hesitated, not slowed. Stopped. The kind of pause that doesn't belong in routine. The room didn't react right away. It took a second for the silence to register, for the air to thicken around it. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, steady and indifferent, while the sound of paper shuffling somewhere behind the counter faded into nothing. Officer Taylor stared at the open file in front of him, eyes fixed on a single section as if something had broken sequence. I noticed it immediately. Mark didn't. He was leaning casually against the counter, one elbow planted, posture loose and confident. The smirk sat comfortably on his face, not loud, not arrogant enough to be obvious, just practiced, the kind that assumes agreement before it's given. "You really don't understand how these procedures work, do you?" he said, not looking at me. His voice was calm, conversational, pitched just loud enough for the receptionist to hear. She smiled politely. I stayed silent. Officer Taylor flipped one page back, then forward again. His pen hovered, unmoving now, suspended above the paper. Mark exhaled softly, amused. "This part always takes longer," he added, glancing toward the waiting area as if including the room in his explanation. "They verify everything twice." A young couple sitting across from us leaned closer together. An older man near the window lowered his phone. The receptionist nodded. "It's standard." Her eyes were on Mark, not on me. Officer Taylor's pen finally touched the paper, but only to underline something, once, cleanly. Then he stopped again. "I'll need to review this section separately," he said, closing the folder halfway. His tone was even, procedural. "Please hold." He stood and walked toward the secured office without waiting for a response. The door shut behind him with a soft, final click. The room shifted. Without the officer present, the atmosphere loosened in the wrong direction, like authority had stepped out and assumptions rushed back in to fill the space. Mark chuckled under his breath. "See, nothing serious." He turned toward me for the first time, eyebrows lifting slightly. They get dramatic about files. I didn't answer. The receptionist straightened a stack of forms. She said, carefully neutral. "Sometimes paperwork is submitted out of order," she said, carefully neutral. "It doesn't mean anything is wrong." Mark nodded, satisfied. "Exactly." He placed his hand lightly on the counter, closer to her than to me. "She doesn't really deal with the paperwork," he added. "I handle that part." The receptionist smiled again. I watched her shift her body just enough to face him more directly. I remained where I was. From my position, I could see into the secured office through the narrow glass panel. Officer Taylor stood at his desk now, the file open again. He wasn't scanning. He was comparing. He removed a thin blue page from the center of the folder and laid it beside another document, aligning their edges with precision. Mark followed my gaze and scoffed quietly. "You're overthinking it." I folded my hands together, resting them lightly against my bag. Minutes passed. Not rushed minutes, measured ones. The printer behind the desk finished its cycle and went silent. No one moved to collect the pages. Conversations in the waiting area faded into whispers. Mark shifted his weight, crossing his arms now. The smirk hadn't vanished, but it had tightened, controlled, deliberate. "They'll probably just restamp it," he said. "That happens when payments are split." The receptionist hesitated. "Your payment cleared in full, $7,500. "I know. That's why this is taking longer. They double-check anything over a certain amount." She nodded, reassured. Officer Taylor picked up the blue page again. He paused at the bottom, then reached for his phone. Mark's foot tapped once against the floor. "He's calling someone," Mark muttered. "Unnecessary." Officer Taylor spoke quietly into the receiver. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw the shape of them. Case number, authorization. The receptionist stood. "I can see if he needs—" Officer Taylor lifted one finger without looking down. She stopped mid-step, sat back down. That small motion carried more authority than any raised voice. Mark noticed it too. His jaw tightened briefly before relaxing again. "Unbelievable," he said under his breath. Officer Taylor hung up the phone. He wrote something on the margin of the document, then slid the blue page back into the folder, but not where it had been before. He closed the file fully. Then he stood. The door opened. The room straightened instinctively as Officer Taylor stepped out, the file tucked firmly under his arm. He approached the desk with measured steps and placed the file down carefully. "Mr. Carter," he said, looking directly at Mark, "before we proceed, I need to clarify the sequence of authorizations on this application." Mark smiled, polite, controlled. "Sure." Officer Taylor rotated the folder so it faced both of us. He tapped one section with his pen. "This document was finalized prior to joint confirmation." "That's administrative. It doesn't affect eligibility," Mark replied, quickly. "It affects process." His gaze shifted. "Mrs. Carter," he said calmly, "did you receive this document on the same date as the disclosure forms?" Mark answered before I could. "Yes." Officer Taylor didn't look at him. "No," I said. The word landed quietly, but it landed. Officer Taylor's pen hovered, then moved. He made a single notation. Mark laughed too quickly. "That's not what she means." Officer Taylor closed the file. "I'm escalating this review," he said evenly. The receptionist froze. Mark straightened. "Escalating?" "Yes," Officer Taylor replied. "Until the authorization order is confirmed, this application will remain on hold." He drew the file back toward himself. "And until that review is complete, no assumptions will be made." His eyes flicked briefly at Mark's hand resting on the counter, then back to the file. The process was no longer routine, and everyone in the room could feel it. No one acknowledged the pause that had just happened. Officer Taylor didn't explain it. Mark didn't comment on it. The receptionist simply straightened the stack of forms and asked for the next document. Routine resumed, at least on the surface. Mark leaned forward again, resting his forearms on the counter, reclaiming the space in front of him. The brief interruption hadn't unsettled him. It had merely delayed him. "She doesn't really handle the paperwork," he said, voice even, assured. "I do." The receptionist glanced at me for a moment, not long enough to invite response, then slid the next form toward Mark. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was public. I stood right there while the process moved around me, not through me. Officer Taylor returned to his chair and reopened the file. His movements were precise, contained, almost deliberate. He didn't speak, but the way his attention shifted from the paper to the screen, then back again, altered the rhythm of the room. Mark didn't adjust his posture. He didn't slow down. He continued answering questions as they came, sometimes before they were fully asked. Employment history, income verification, residential stability. Each response delivered smoothly, with the confidence of someone accustomed to being deferred to. When the receptionist paused, hesitating over one field, Mark filled it in without looking up. "She tends to mix up dates," he added calmly, as if clarifying a minor technicality. The receptionist nodded and corrected the entry. I said nothing. The waiting area felt tighter now, not physically, but socially. Other couples sat nearby, quiet, attentive in the way people become when they sense imbalance. No one stared openly, but the hierarchy was clear. Mark was being addressed. I was being processed. A folder was placed on the counter, closer to him than to me. He opened it and flipped through the tabs with familiarity, skimming as though the outcome were already decided. Officer Taylor arose again. "We'll need to confirm the payment authorization," he said. The receptionist adjusted her seat. "The initial application fee is $7,500, she read. "Additional processing and verification bring the total to $9,800. Mark nodded immediately. "That's fine." The numbers were entered. A revised total appeared on the screen. I noticed the change beneath it. A handwritten adjustment, neatly crossed and initialed. Not by me. The terminal took longer than expected to load. The screen froze briefly before refreshing. The receptionist frowned slightly. "One moment." Officer Taylor stepped closer, his gaze shifting from the screen to the physical file. He didn't say anything, just held the folder open, waiting. Mark tapped his card lightly against the counter. She understands how competitive this process is. He glanced sideways, not at me, but past me. We prefer to move efficiently. The word prefer carried weight. The terminal beeped, the payment went through, the receipt printed. Officer Taylor accepted it and placed it inside the file, then stopped. He checked the timestamp, checked it again, then closed the folder and rested his hand on top of it. "This application will remain under review," he said evenly. Mark looked up. "Is there a problem?" "There are steps that require confirmation, standard procedure." The receptionist hesitated before pulling the file back from the counter, placing it just out of reach. The questions that followed were no longer conversational, they were procedural. Dates were repeated, figures confirmed, prior entries rechecked against the screen. Mark answered each one, but the flow was gone. His pauses lengthened, his jaw tightened slightly when Officer Taylor interrupted once to clarify a number that had already been given. At one point, a form was slid forward. Officer Taylor tapped a line near the bottom. "This signature needs verification." Mark leaned in. "That's mine." Officer Taylor didn't respond immediately. He turned the page, compared it to another, then to a third. "I'll need to confirm that," he said. Mark straightened. "We've already provided everything." The officer nodded. "I understand." He didn't reopen the folder. The receptionist shifted uncomfortably, then offered, "Would anyone like some water?" "No," Mark said quickly. "We're fine." The waiting area had gone silent. Officer Taylor stood and carried the file toward the scanner. The machine hummed, then stalled briefly before resuming. He watched it until the last page fed through. When he returned, the folder was thicker than before. "For now," he said, "this application will remain pending." Pending. Not approved, not denied, paused by process. "When can we expect an update?" Mark asked, keeping his voice measured. Officer Taylor tapped the folder once. "That will depend on what the documents confirm." As we stepped away from the counter, I caught it. A date on one form didn't align with the submission timeline, and a signature, one that should have been mine, wasn't. I didn't react, I didn't speak, but I remembered exactly where the file had paused.
The copier stopped halfway through its cycle. Not with a sound, just a pause, the kind that makes you look up without knowing why. I stood there, watching the indicator light blink once, then go still, and I knew the process had slowed down in a way it hadn't for Mark. No one said anything. No one needed to. The room had already taught me what silence meant here. By then, we weren't at the front desk anymore. We'd been moved, politely, efficiently, to a smaller consultation area with glass walls and neutral chairs. The shift felt administrative, but it wasn't accidental. It was containment. The process had entered a different lane. Mark took the seat closest to the officer, angled forward, shoulders open. The same posture he'd used all morning. Confident, familiar, as if he'd done this before. As if the system recognized him. I sat where I was directed, not beside him, slightly back, close enough to hear everything, far enough to be unnecessary. The folder stayed on the table between them, thick, structured, tidy, tabs aligned. It had weight now, not just paper weight, but procedural gravity. Every time Officer Taylor touched it, Mark adjusted his answers, even when the questions hadn't changed. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct. I didn't explain. Instead, I watched the order in which things were asked. Income first, then employment history, then address verification. Each answer unlocked the next step, not because they were persuasive, but because they were expected. Mark knew the rhythm. He anticipated the pauses, filled them smoothly, offered context that wasn't requested. "She works flexible hours," he said at one point, glancing toward me without turning his body. "That's why I usually handle the forms." It wasn't an insult. It didn't need to be. The officer nodded, typed something, and moved on. That was the pattern. Statements that framed decisions, assumptions that became entries, and a system that rarely asked who was missing, only whether the box was filled. I let it happen. When the financial section began, the room changed again. Not visibly, but in tempo. The questions tightened, the phrasing lost warmth. Fees, breakdowns, prior payments. The number appeared on the screen between them, $9,800, higher than the original estimate, explained calmly as a combination of processing adjustments and administrative review. Mark didn't flinch. He nodded once. "I can authorize that," he said. The officer looked at me then, not directly, just long enough to confirm something, then back to the screen. I noticed the payer name before anyone mentioned it. It wasn't mine. The authorization moved forward anyway. A card was placed on the table. Mark slid it closer. The machine whirred softly, then paused, as if considering. That pause didn't stop the process. It only slowed it. While the officer adjusted the device, I leaned forward, not to speak, but to see. The edge of the folder lifted slightly as pages were shifted. A date printed at the top of one form caught my eye. It didn't align with the submission timeline we'd been given. I memorized it. No reaction, no signal, just storage. When the payment went through, the officer marked something on the file. A check maybe, or a flag. I couldn't see the symbol, but I saw the hesitation before it. Mark reached for a cup of water offered from the side, took a sip, set it down untouched after that. The conversation continued, but the energy didn't recover its earlier smoothness. Answers stayed confident, but the rhythm was gone. Mark began waiting half a beat longer before responding, as if checking himself against something invisible. I stayed still. This wasn't preparation that required movement. It required clarity. When we were told there would be a short wait before the next step, Mark stood immediately, phone already in hand. He paced near the glass wall, voice low, reassuring, speaking to someone who wasn't there. I didn't follow him. Instead, I stood and approached the copier again, quietly, slowly. The machine had reset itself. The light was steady now. I placed a stack of pages inside, pages I'd already read once. They copied cleanly. I folded them carefully and slid them into my bag. Nothing dramatic, no rush, just alignment. Outside the room, I used the few minutes alone to forward emails I'd flagged weeks earlier. Automated confirmations, payment notices, an adjustment message that came late one night with an amount that didn't match any invoice we'd signed. $10,200. I sent it to myself again, labeled it clearly, then archived the thread. When Mark returned, he didn't notice the bag was heavier. The officer came back with a neutral expression and a different posture, straighter, more deliberate. The folder was under his arm now, not on the table. "We'll need to review a few items internally. Standard procedure." Mark smiled, smaller this time. "Of course." I watched the folder as it was placed on a side desk, watched the top page lift slightly from the rest, like it wanted to separate. That's when I saw the signature. Not mine. Close, but not right. The stroke was confident, clean, and wrong. I didn't say anything. I didn't have to. By then, the file had already started telling a different story. Officer Taylor didn't raise his voice when he spoke again. He didn't need to. He closed the folder in front of him with one measured motion and placed his hand flat on top of it, as if grounding something that had just shifted. The sound was soft, but it landed heavier than anything Mark had said all morning. "We're going to pause this intake," he said, looking at the desk, not at either of us. "I need to initiate a procedural review." For the first time, the room moved without Mark directing it. The woman who had been guiding us through the paperwork stopped mid-step. Another staff member near the hallway slowed, then turned back. Chairs shifted. The low hum of the office seemed to thin out, replaced by a silence that felt official. Mark let out a small, confused laugh. It was automatic, reflexive. "A review?" he said. "Is there a problem?" Officer Taylor finally looked up. His expression wasn't suspicious or hostile. It was neutral, almost clinical. "There may be," he replied. "That's what the review determines." Mark leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. I recognized the posture. It was the one he used when he assumed time was on his side. "This is all standard," he said. "We've already submitted everything. Fees are paid, forms are signed. We've been very cooperative." Officer Taylor nodded once, slowly. Then he opened the folder again. He didn't turn pages quickly. He didn't skim. He moved with deliberate patience, as if each sheet mattered exactly as much as it said it did. "I'm seeing two versions of the financial responsibility agreement," he said, "submitted on different dates, same case number."
The staff member beside him frowned. That shouldn't... Officer Taylor lifted one finger, not sharply, just enough to pause her. One lists a joint payer, the other lists a single authorizing party. Mark's arms unfolded. That's normal, he said quickly. We were advised to streamline the process. My wife doesn't handle finances. No one looked at me when he said it. Officer Taylor, however, didn't look at Mark either. He was comparing 2 pages side by side. The signatures are not consistent, he said, and the notarization stamps differ. The room felt smaller then, not louder, smaller. A man from the waiting area stood and quietly guided his child toward the exit, sensing something had shifted. The office hadn't closed, but the energy had narrowed, focusing inward. Mark leaned forward. Are you suggesting there's been an error? I'm suggesting, Officer Taylor replied evenly, that there's enough discrepancy to require verification. He slid 1 page slightly forward on the desk. This signature, he said, tapping near the bottom, it authorizes a payment adjustment of $9,800. Mark glanced at it, then back at Officer Taylor. Yes, that's correct. Officer Taylor's finger moved, not to the name, but to the date. This document was submitted 3 days before the adjustment request was logged, which would make the authorization retroactive. The staff member swallowed. That's not standard. Mark exhaled through his nose. We were told timing flexibility was allowed. Officer Taylor finally turned his attention fully to him. Flexibility, he said, doesn't override consent. For the first time, Mark looked uncertain, not alarmed, just slightly off balance, like someone realizing the ground wasn't where they thought it was. Officer Taylor turned to the staff member. Please pull the original intake file, the one logged at the initial payment amount. She hesitated. That file is archived. Then unarchive it. She nodded and hurried away. Mark looked at me then, really looked. His expression wasn't angry, it was searching, as if he expected me to explain something. I met his eyes briefly, said nothing. Officer Taylor continued calmly. Mrs. He paused, checked the file, then continued. Mrs. You are listed here as a primary participant in this process. Any changes to authorization would require your documented consent. Mark opened his mouth, then closed it. The staff member beside the desk shifted her weight. So what does this mean for the case? Officer Taylor closed the second folder. It means the process is formally paused pending verification of consent and payment legitimacy. Paused. The word landed cleanly, final for now. Mark's confidence cracked, not shattered, just fractured enough to show something underneath. This is all standard, he said. We're wasting time. Officer Taylor met his gaze without challenge. Time is less important than accuracy. He turned back to me. You'll be contacted directly regarding next steps. I nodded. No one asked Mark anything else. As we stood to leave, I felt the shift fully, not triumph, not relief, but balance. The room no longer leaned toward him. The process no longer flowed around me. It moved between us. And for the first time since we'd walked into that office, I wasn't being processed. I was being recognized. The office had quieted in a way that felt deliberate. Officer Taylor's fingers rested lightly on the edge of the file, but the subtle tension in his posture spoke volumes. Mark was shifting, first subtly, then more noticeably, as if the confidence he had carried all day had begun to fracture. The staff, who had lingered near the edges of the room, were now fully attentive, their eyes flicking between the officer, Mark, and me, unsure what might unfold. I stayed seated, my hands folded, my posture neutral, but my mind was acutely aware of every small movement, every pause, every almost imperceptible breath. Taylor began reviewing the papers once more, carefully, systematically, letting each line, each number, each signature speak for itself. The air in the room seemed to hold its breath with him. Mark attempted a small smile, but it faltered instantly when the officer's pen hovered over one form and didn't move. A micro-frown crossed his face. He tried to interject, offering explanations that had no context without the full record, but the officer's gaze barely shifted, unwavering, commanding.
The file revealed more than just inconsistencies. It displayed the carelessness of assumptions, the tiny errors that cumulatively undermined control. Officer Taylor noted the signature differences, the fee misallocations, and the subtle discrepancies I had flagged in my quiet preparation. He did not raise his voice. He did not dramatize. The weight of authority alone was enough. Every micro-hesitation, every misstatement, every misalignment in the paperwork was quietly, undeniably confirmed. Mark's smirk had vanished. Confidence, once seemingly unshakable, now teetered under the authority of law and procedure. He glanced at me briefly, perhaps searching for some sense of control or alliance, and found only calm, measured composure. My internal steadiness, honed through observation and preparation, contrasted sharply with the outward signs of his unraveling. The officer addressed the room with a firm, even tone. "These inconsistencies must be corrected before the adoption process can proceed," he said, marking clear directives on the paperwork, without adding judgment, without raising emotion. Staff moved to comply, their hesitation giving way to action as the path forward became procedural and unavoidable. I observed it all silently, noting how authority and law had shifted the balance. Control was no longer dictated by personality, by smirks, or by casual manipulation. It was dictated by facts, documents, and formal procedure. Mark tried to argue, to reassert himself, but every motion, every word he offered was met with calm verification. The officer's attention never wavered. The room held its formality, and the legal weight of accuracy and procedure steadily eclipsed personal bravado. The subtle power of patient observation and careful preparation I had enacted in secret was now manifest. Everything I had quietly recorded, every detail saved, and every consultation noted formed a shield I could now walk behind with total confidence. Finally, the officer closed the file with deliberate precision. He looked up briefly, making eye contact, and then spoke to both of us. "All matters have been confirmed. Corrections are required, and the adoption process will resume only when they are properly addressed." His words were neutral, but their implication was unmistakable. Accountability was restored, and no personal influence could override the documented truth. Mark's posture shifted further, a mixture of resignation and disbelief. The staff exhaled collectively, relief and respect flickering across their faces as they realized the process had been safeguarded. I remained composed, my attention still controlled, my breathing steady, knowing that the patience, the silence, and the preparation had brought this moment into being. Nothing had been said in anger, no insults had been exchanged, yet the outcome was absolute. Authority and diligence had rectified the imbalance. I collected my notes and gently closed my own folder, the movement deliberate, almost ceremonial. There was no triumph in gesture, no celebration in voice. Everything was deliberate, everything controlled. Even Mark, standing beside me, had no opportunity to project power. The office, once a theater of subtle humiliation, was now a stage of measured resolution, guided by procedure, not performance. As we stood to leave, Officer Taylor's presence remained firm but unobtrusive, his authority a quiet sentinel behind the desk. Mark followed silently, a stark contrast to the earlier confidence he had worn so casually. I walked beside him, my composure intact, unshaken by the tension that had dominated the previous hours. The silent confidence that had been my ally now carried me forward, proof that patience, observation, and preparation can turn the tide without raising a voice. The finality of the moment settled softly around me. The adoption process, though momentarily paused, would continue, safeguarded by accuracy and law. No dramatic confrontation, no theatrics. Only quiet, undeniable correctness had prevailed. And in that silence, the victory was complete. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. The law, procedure, and patience had done it for me. Authority had spoken. The imbalance had been corrected. Respect, not fear, now lingered in the room, and as I stepped out of the office, the weight of quiet victory rested lightly, firmly, and irreversibly on my shoulders.